Have you ever felt like you're being watched, even though you're completely alone? Now imagine waking up to that feeling every night. That was life for the Pritchard family, just an ordinary household living quietly in Pontefract, England, until something decided to move in with them. Something dark, sinister, and terrifyingly real. Locals called it the Black Monk, and the family would soon learn it had a purpose being there. But why the Pritchards? And what exactly was this entity that haunted their dreams and waking hours alike? Settle in, because today, we're unraveling one of Britain's most chilling and unexplainable paranormal mysteries, the haunting of the Black Monk of Pontefract. Pontefract, a seemingly quiet, historical market town nestled in West Yorkshire, England. At first glance, it might look just like any other charming British town. Cobbled streets, friendly local pubs, and homes standing silently as if keeping centuries-old secrets. But behind this quiet facade lies a deeper, darker past. Pontefract's history stretches back to medieval times, with its heart defined by the infamous Pontefract Castle. Once a powerful fortress, the castle was at the center of countless battles, political intrigue, and ruthless executions. Kings and rebels met their fates within its stone walls, including Richard II, who famously died under mysterious circumstances. It's these layers of history, filled with bloodshed, betrayal, and tragedy, that gave birth to countless legends of hauntings. Over the generations, residents have whispered about phantom soldiers roaming battlements, ghostly voices drifting through empty halls, and eerie figures glimpsed in the castle ruins long after sunset. In Pontefract, tales of ghosts aren't just stories told around a fire, they're woven into the fabric of everyday life. Yet, despite the many ghostly sightings, nothing compares to the chilling events that began to unfold in the late 1960s at a modest house on 30 East Drive. A haunting so aggressive and terrifying that it would come to overshadow every other tale, making Pontefract infamous worldwide as the home of the dreaded Black Monk. It all started in August of 1966, when the Pritchard family left for a short vacation to Devon. Jean and Joe Pritchard, along with their daughter Diane, packed their bags and headed out, leaving behind their 15-year-old son, Philip. He decided to stay home at 30 East Drive, with his grandmother, Sarah Scholes, there to keep an eye on things. At first, everything seemed peaceful. Philip spent his time outside in the garden, reading under the rare stretch of late summer sunshine, while Sarah sat inside, knitting quietly. But despite the warmth outside, Sarah couldn't shake a deep chill that settled over the house. It didn't make sense, and when the windows rattled violently and the back door slammed shut from a sudden, powerful gust of wind, Philip had noticed something strange. Outside, the air was still. No wind, no storm. Inside, the real storm had already begun. Later that afternoon, Philip walked back into the living room, carrying tea for his grandmother, and stopped in his steps. A thick, grey-white dust hung in the air, swirling around Sarah like a slow-moving cloud. It wasn't falling from the ceiling, as if plaster had crumbled. It simply floated there, heavy and unnatural. The dust left a fine coating across everything, the furniture, the carpets, even the fresh cup of tea Philip held in his hand. Sarah, confused and a little annoyed, blamed Philip for the mess, but in all reality, he had no idea how it had happened. Looking for answers, Sarah went across the street to her daughter Marie's house. Marie had no explanation either, only a natural instinct to start cleaning. But that's when the next phenomenon appeared. As Marie crossed the kitchen, she slipped across the floor, where a perfectly round puddle of water had formed out of nowhere. Then another appeared, and another. They pulled up the floor covering to check for leaks, but the floorboards underneath were dry. They shut off the water supply. The puddles kept forming. Even after the water company came out to investigate, no one could find a cause. August had been dry and warm. There was no reason for condensation, and just as mysteriously as they had started, the puddles stopped. Later that same evening, Philip called out again. Sugar and tea leaves had been scattered all across the kitchen. Sarah hurried in, and both of them stood frozen as they watched the button on the wall-mounted tea dispenser repeatedly press itself in and out. Even after all the tea had spilt out, the mechanism kept moving, as if pressed by invisible hands. Then came the crash, when they opened the hallway door. Nobody was there, just a potted plant, somehow sitting halfway up the stairs, and the empty pot it once lived in smashed against the top landing. From there, things escalated. Cupboards rattled violently, doors slammed, and dishes clattered inside locked cabinets. The air inside the house felt heavier by the minute, as if something unseen was winding tighter around them. When they finally tried to sleep that night, Philip lay rigid in bed, staring in horror as the wardrobe across the room slowly swayed back and forth on its own. That was it. They fled to Marie's house across the street. The police were called. They found no intruder, no break-in, no reasonable explanation for the events that unfolded that day. When they returned to the house, they found their paintings torn from the walls, the glass shattered, and John and Joe's wedding photo slashed straight across the center as if by claws. When Jean, Joe, and Diane returned from holiday days later, they were greeted with a story almost too bizarre to believe. Skeptical, Joe jokingly asked for a sign. The house answered with a sudden ice-cold blast of air, followed by 3 loud, deliberate knocks that seemed to come from nowhere. And just like that, everything went quiet. For 2 whole years, the Pritchards lived in uneasy silence, but silence, they would learn, was only the eye of the storm. In 1968, it returned. It began again during a simple redecoration of Diane's bedroom. Blankets were thrown down the stairs, potted plants overturned themselves, buckets and paintbrushes were hurled across rooms. At night, decorating supplies floated in mid-air, circling like debris caught in a whirlwind no one could see. The entity's focus was clear: Diane. One night, as she climbed the staircase, the lights cut out. In the faint glow from outside, she saw a massive shadow looming on the wall. Before she could react, a heavy oak hall stand tore itself free and slammed into her, pinning her against the stairs. Moments later, an electric sewing machine was hurled on top of her. Jean and Philip tried desperately to lift the stand, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if invisible hands pressed it down. Only when Diane stopped struggling, relaxing into the weight, did the hall stand slide free on its own. Somehow, she was uninjured. No broken bones, not even a bruise. But the night wasn't over. As she tried to sleep, her mattress was violently flipped from under her. Once, twice, 4 times, throwing her onto the floor again and again. And then, things became even stranger. During a visit from a skeptical relative known as Auntie M, the entity decided to make its presence undeniable. Late at night, as Auntie M watched from bed, her own 2 gloves appeared in the bedroom. One hovered at the top of the door. The other hovered just inches above the floor. There was no way a human being could reach both places at once. The gloves floated forward, but when she didn't respond, they clenched into fists and shook threateningly. Auntie M screamed in terror. Later, she burned the gloves in her backyard, convinced something evil had worn them. From then on, the family called the presence Fred, as it became an everyday reality. Lights would snap off without warning. Loud crashes would shake the house at all hours. The Black Monk was no longer content to stay hidden. He left bruises, broken furniture, slashed photographs, and filled the house with an overwhelming feeling of dread. Yet through it all, the Pritchards stayed. It was their home, and they refused to give it up. But as they would discover, so did the Black Monk. By now, the Pritchards were convinced they weren't just dealing with random, ghostly mischief. What haunted 30 East Drive felt ancient, purposeful, and the figure that so many had glimpsed, the shadowy man in a long black robe, seemed to hold the key to the mystery. Locals quickly began referring to the entity as the Black Monk, but who or what was he? Pontefract, after all, has a history soaked in blood and tragedy. Just down the road from 30 East Drive once stood Pontefract Priory, a Cluniac monastery founded in the 11th century. And during those dark medieval times, justice was often cruel and swift. According to one of the most chilling theories, the Black Monk had once been a real man, a monk who lived in the area hundreds of years earlier. Legend has it that this monk committed horrific crimes, including the rape and murder of a young girl. When the townspeople discovered what he had done, they took matters into their own hands. He was found guilty and executed, hanged just a short distance from where 30 East Drive would eventually be built. Some believe the monk's spirit, still stained by guilt, rage, and violence, was never at peace. Instead, it remained trapped, festering in the very soil beneath the future neighborhood. And when the Pritchards moved in, it was as if their arrival stirred the long-dormant spirit awake. Another theory suggests that 30 East Drive may sit near, or even directly above, an ancient, forgotten gallows site. Places of execution often leave behind a deep psychic imprint, a kind of scar in the landscape that draws in restless energy like a magnet. If that's true, the Black Monk may not have been the only dark presence tied to the area, but he was, without a doubt, the strongest and the most dangerous. Others speculate that the spirit's rage had less to do with punishment and more with unfinished business, that perhaps he was wrongfully accused, betrayed by his own community, and that centuries of bitterness and anger wrapped his spirit into something hostile, something vengeful. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. This was no harmless prankster spirit, no wandering lost soul looking for comfort. The Black Monk was violent, territorial, and it was becoming clear that the Pritchard family were trapped inside their own home and they needed some serious help. As the attacks grew more violent, it became clear that whatever haunted 30 East Drive was not just seeking attention, it was capable of real harm. Vic Kelly, Jean's brother-in-law who lived across the street, believed a Catholic exorcism might be the family's only hope. He approached his own priest, Father Hudson, to ask for help. Although Father Hudson was hesitant to perform a full exorcism, he suggested they begin by blessing the house with holy water. Vic moved from room to room, sprinkling the water throughout the home, ending in the living room, the area where the entity's presence always seemed strongest. Before he could even finish, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Water began pouring down the walls in thick, steady streams. The blessing had not calmed the entity, it had provoked it. The violence only escalated. One afternoon, as Diane was combing her hair, a brass crucifix was torn from the mantel and hurled at her. It didn't simply bounce off, it stuck to her back, pressed against her skin as if magnetized. Diane panicked, running through the house, unable to pull it off. Jean tried to pry it loose, but it wouldn't budge. Eventually, the crucifix fell away on its own, leaving behind a deep, red cross-shaped mark that remained for days afterwards. But that wasn't the end. One night, Joe and John were awakened by a slow creak of their bedroom door opening. In the darkness, they saw the tall, hooded figure of a man standing in the doorway. Before they could move, the figure vanished into the shadows. The disturbances grew louder and more aggressive. The banging noises became deafening. Heavy breathing was often heard just outside bedroom doors. The entity's presence was no longer subtle. It was a force that could not be ignored. And then came the most violent attack. One evening, Diane went downstairs to make coffee. As she moved through the hallway, the lights went out. Jean heard her daughter scream and ran to help, finding Diane being dragged up the staircase. Even without light, the family could clearly see Diane's cardigan stretched outward, pulled by something unseen. One hand seemed to be gripping her clothing, the other around her throat. Philip and Jean scrambled to free her. As soon as they reached her, the grip released, and all of them fell back down the stairs. Diane was left with visible handprints and bruises around her neck. That attack was the breaking point. Desperate, Joe and Jean tried anything they could think of. Following an old tradition, they hung garlic throughout the house, hoping it might drive the entity away. And funny as it may sound, it worked well for a little while. Life, for the first time in years, returned to something close to normal. But nearly a decade later, the haunting would once again be pulled into the public eye. A local historian named Tom Cuniff took an interest in the case during his research into the Cluniac monks, who once lived near Pontefract. His investigation drew attention to the theory that the Black Monk may have originated from the ruins of the ancient priory. Paranormal researcher and author Colin Wilson later took up the story, publishing details of the haunting and linking it to patterns seen in other poltergeist cases. Phenomena centering around emotional unrest and adolescents going through puberty. When the haunting first began, Philip was 15 and reportedly experiencing tension with his father, a classic trigger for poltergeist manifestations. After Philip grew older and left home, the activity seemed to quieten until Diane, entering her own teenage years, became the new target. Although early newspaper reports in the Yorkshire Evening Post and the Pontefract and Castleford Express briefly covered the haunting, little official action was taken at the time. Word of the haunting, however, spread among locals. Curious onlookers would gather outside 30 East Drive, sometimes camping overnight, hoping to hear the unexplained knocks and crashes that often echoed from within. John Pritchard refused to let strangers into her home, but it didn't matter. The disturbances were so loud, they could often be heard from the street. After the publication of Wilson's book, the haunting became a topic of national curiosity, then, as quickly as it had risen, faded back into relative obscurity. The Pritchard children eventually grew up, and moved away. Jean and Joe remained in the house. According to the neighbors and friends, though, the entity known as Fred never truly left. Even after all the years, 30 East Drive was never just an ordinary home again. As the story of the Black Monk spread, so did the divide between skeptics and believers. So, on the skeptics' side, it's easy to point out some irregularities in the case. The entity's appearances were inconsistent, sometimes highly active, sometimes completely absent, for months or even years. The main target of the activity, Diane, was a teenage girl at the time, aligning with patterns seen in other poltergeist cases involving adolescent energy. Once Diane grew older and moved out, it was like the spirit had given up. People also highlight the more theatrical moments described. Garlic strung up around the house in a desperate attempt to ward off the spirit, or Auntie M's sighting of gloves clenching into fists. To some, these instances feel exaggerated, fueled by fear, suggestion, or even the pressure of living inside a house with a growing reputation. They argue that if this were truly the most violent poltergeist in Britain, the evidence would be clearer, filmed, or documented. But believers see a different picture. They point to the deep and violent history of Pontefract, the executions, the nearby monastery, the centuries of bloodshed that left scars on the land long before the house was ever built. They argue that the sheer number of eyewitnesses cannot be so easily dismissed. Family members, neighbors, visiting friends, police officers, and even passers-by who heard the crashes and bangs from outside the house all reported unexplained phenomena. Importantly, even after the Pritchards moved out, accounts of activity continued to surface. Later, tenants and investigators reported similar experiences, cold spots, apparitions, and unexplainable noises, suggesting that something about 30 East Drive itself holds a lingering malevolent presence. For believers, the Black Monk wasn't just a family's ghost story, it was a manifestation of something ancient, something deeply rooted in the land and history of Pontefract, something that didn't vanish just because the headlines did. In the end, whether you view the Black Monk as a trick of the mind, a desperate hoax, or a real glimpse into the paranormal, one fact remains. The mystery of 30 East Drive refuses to stay buried. The Pritchard family stayed at 30 East Drive far longer than anyone might have expected. Despite the fear, the attacks, and the endless disturbances, they refused to let the entity chase them away. But the haunting didn't just leave its mark on the Pritchards, it changed Pontefract itself. Locals would pause outside the house in the early mornings, staring at the windows, half expecting the lights to flicker or a shadow to move past the curtains. Curious visitors came from nearby towns, and soon from much farther away. Stories of the Black Monk traveled beyond Pontefract, taking on a life of their own. In the 1980s, the haunting caught the attention of author Colin Wilson, a well-known researcher of the paranormal. His book, Poltergeist, helped to solidify the Black Monk of Pontefract as one of Britain's most famous and most disturbing poltergeist cases. Wilson's account drew new attention to the haunting, blending local legend with psychological theories, but always circling back to the chilling possibility that something truly unexplainable had occurred. And of course, the story found its way onto the screen. In 2012, the film When the Lights Went Out was released, loosely inspired by the events at 30 East Drive. While the film took creative liberties, it captured the atmosphere of dread, isolation, and helplessness that so many said defined life inside that house. Today, 30 East Drive stands almost like a museum of fear. Paranormal investigations, documentary filmmakers, and thrill seekers continue to visit. The house can even be rented overnight for those brave enough to stay. But with all the legends, all the retellings, and all the investigations, one thing remains. There is no hard, scientific proof that the Black Monk ever existed. No photos, no video recordings, just layers of eyewitness accounts, testimony after testimony, building a story that feels too detailed but too consistent to dismiss. I don't know. Some say it was a case of fear feeding fear, powered by psychological tension and human imagination, while others point out the history and the sheer number of witnesses. Maybe the real haunting lies somewhere between belief and doubt, between what we can see and what we fear might still be lurking just out of sight. The Black Monk of Pontefract remains a mystery, and sometimes the absence of a clear answer is what makes a story impossible to forget. So in the end, it's up to you to decide what you believe. I don't know if I'm a true believer myself, but you definitely wouldn't catch me spending a night in that house. So say what you will, Whether it was a restless spirit, a deep psychic imprint, or something we still don't fully understand, the events at 30 East Drive left behind more questions than answers. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you experienced something you couldn't explain? Or do you think there is a rational reason behind the unknown? I'd love to hear your story. Until next time.